That was the point at which it was obvious there was a mistake at the base of this whole ridiculous doctrine of super PACs. This is huge because there's never been a court that has said there's a risk of corruption, but there's nothing that people can do about it. And so we think this is the clearest reason why we're gonna win in the First Circuit. And when we win in the First Circuit, we will then be in the Supreme Court. We could, by 2028, end super PACs, not just in Maine, but across the nation under federal law.
We are trying to get our government back. It's a political and revolution, not a physical one, obviously. And we have come up with a couple of different ideas here that we're trying to execute. And several of you asked really important questions about money in politics. And the top expert in the country is Harvard Law professor Larry Lessig. And he's joining us now to answer your questions, which is amazing. So Professor Lessig, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Cheng. Thanks for having me.
No problem. All right, so first question that those in our audience asked were, how about the boycott, divestment, and sanction bills, or the anti-BDS bills in the states? About 30 states have passed them, saying that if you try to boycott the Israeli government, there'll be financial consequences, etc. They said, given that Citizens United says that you're allowed to have any opinion and spend money on your opinion, why are those laws legal?
I don't think they will be held to be legal. They'll just scare a bunch of people and make a bunch of lawyers wealthy as they get hired to have to litigate the question. But the idea of boycott is a core First Amendment value, and it ought to be absolutely protected under the traditions the First Amendment protects.
So bottom line is, it hasn't been challenged effectively enough in the courts. It will not withstand legal scrutiny, you think?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, and by the way, you don't need Citizens United for that. That's actually a violation of freedom of speech, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so
unless it's a corporation. If it's a corporation that's protesting, I haven't seen any corporations with signs out there on the street. But if it is a corporation, then maybe they need Citizens United. I don't know.
No, actually, that was the genesis of the question. So let's just spend one more minute on that, and then I want to move to the Montana law, which is really interesting, or proposal. So because the person who wrote in and said, it's companies' contracts that are being canceled by those anti-BDS bills, and don't corporations have basically not extra rights, but theoretically the same rights of freedom of speech that we do because of Citizens United? So I know they don't care about, sometimes the Supreme Court doesn't seem to care about our actual speech, but they do care about corporation speech. So isn't that doubly a violation of both the actual First Amendment and Citizens United?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can always make it more complicated than it should in principle be. And so there might be a distinction between a corporation that's doing business with a city who finds themselves boycotted or canceled because of the political position they take. And the city might take the position, look, we don't have to do business with anybody, we can choose who we want to do business with. But I think the core First Amendment principle ought to prevail, and we ought to say that all of us are free to engage in political speech as long as it's nonviolent, and even if it's stuff people don't find popular.
All right, so now let's go to Montana, because that one's a layup, right? So Montana has got a proposal to say, to tackle Citizens United in a different direction. I found it interesting, and I thought for sure you would have an opinion on this. So can you tell us what it is before we break down whether it makes sense or not?
Yeah, so Montana is trying to exercise its control over corporations that are chartered in Montana and corporations that are going to be doing business in Montana. And the basic claim is that they have the right to say to those corporations, look, you can be chartered in our state, but only under the following conditions. And one of the conditions is that you're not going to be spending money in this particular way. And they can choose not to be chartered in the state. They can choose to do business elsewhere. But it's the condition that you're not going to be in that, you're not going to be engaging in political speech using your corporate money. And so this too is a kind of innovative idea being pressed by Center for American Progress. And the idea would be it would pass in Montana, maybe it would pass in some other states. The real limit, the real question will be whether it can be enforced against other corporations chartered in other states. and whether those corporations have a right to operate in Montana, even though under Montana law, if they were incorporated there, they wouldn't have the same privilege. And that's going to be another fight that the courts are going to have to resolve. 120 years ago, the courts seemed to say that the answer was no, you couldn't have a local charter that interfered with an interstate company engaging in what is considered First Amendment rights. But we'd have to see how that played out in the court today.
Interesting. So let's break it down one by one. So first of all, corporations don't exist in nature, right? The media sometimes talks about them like as if they've always been around. No, you literally have to allow them to exist legally, right? So since the government does get to control whether they're chartered or not, Montana is fully within its rights to say, if you're going to be chartered, you have to follow these rules. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, as long as they're constitutional rules, right?
Right. And so in this case, would it only affect the corporations incorporated in Montana? And so if there was a corporation incorporated in Delaware but does business in Montana, would it not affect them?
Well, that's the question that I think is really not fully resolved. And you can see lots of cases where, you would hope it's not resolved in an easy way. Like, so imagine it was like Idaho, and Idaho said, you can't do business in the state of Idaho if you provide family planning services to your employees wherever those employees happen to be. You would say, look, it might be okay for Idaho to have that rule for Idaho corporations, but should they have that rule for corporations from Massachusetts or California and be able to enforce it against them? And so that's the fight that's going to happen about whether you can have extraterritorial application of your law, however popular you might think that law is.
Okay, so I sense that obviously that's going to be an issue for this particular proposal on defeating Citizens United, right? So then let me go one more layer on that. So if just Montana passes it, I can see the courts saying, well, you don't have a right to control all these corporations that do business in other states, right? Okay, but what if 35 states passed it? Would it change the dynamic there at all, given that it seems to be the majority of the country and majority of the states that have gone in that direction?
Well, it would affect the effectiveness of that regulation, but until this question is resolved, it wouldn't affect the states that were in the other 15 or 16 jurisdictions that wouldn't necessarily have this control. So I think there's a certainty to this proposal. There's also a limit to the proposal, and the limit is exactly how broad it can be made to be without having universal coverage across the country.
So it's possible that we can get all 49 states to say, well, you can't get a corporate charter unless you agree not to spend money in politics. But if Delaware holds out, everybody could just be based in Delaware and kind of.
That's the question.
Yeah, can they end this whole project by doing that? And it seems like that's an open question. All right, well, look, I love that people are trying to get around it in different ways. And I also love that a lot of the campaign finance reform proposals come out of Montana. And now we've got a lot of the right wing that has, basically the battle's been joined, that are saying, no, the problem is money in politics, we figured it out. Right, and so all these folks are serving their donors. So let's talk about, you originally came on Operation Hope when it was a smaller group, and you made an ask of us to help support the ballot measure in Maine, and we did, and that was actually the one campaign finance reform ballot measure that passed in 2024. So I'm super proud of the volunteers at TYT who did that. So can you tell us the latest on that ballot measure? What happens next?
Yeah, so it was an amazing victory. We got 74.9% of the vote. 600,000 people in Maine voted. That's more who voted for that initiative than have ever voted for anything or any candidate in the history of Maine. And it was deeply cross-partisan. I gathered signatures on Election Day 2023 to get the ballot initiative on the ballot. And the first guy who came up to me said, I'm here gathering signatures to get Donald Trump on the ballot. What are you here for? And I showed him the initiative and he read it and he said, hell yeah. And he signed it and he said, I'm going to get everybody signing my petition to come over and sign your initiative as well. And that's what he did for the time that he was there. So this shows this is the one issue that unites us. So we won overwhelmingly. It was within 1 month challenge by 2 super PACs in Maine, backed by Leonard Leo. And those super PACs then argued in the district court in May of last year, this year. And in that argument, they said this violated the Constitution. And our lawyer so we've intervened, as well as the Attorney General of Maine is obviously defending it. Our lawyer is Neil Katyal, and Neil Katyal got that district court judge to acknowledge one critical fact, which is why we are going to win. So every single court that has upheld the First Amendment limit on the ability to limit contributions to independent political action committees, that's the principle that gave us super PACs, have done so saying there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption when you make a contribution to a super PAC. I mean, it's kind of bizarre. Anybody could have thought that, but 4 circuit courts held that in the 2010 to 2014 period. And that's what created super PACs. But our district court said, well, of course, there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption when you make a large contribution to a super PAC. But she said, even though there's a risk, that doesn't mean that the First Amendment doesn't protect them to make that contribution. This is huge because there's never been a court that has said there's a risk of corruption, but there's nothing that people can do about it. And so we think this is the clearest reason why we're going to win in the First Circuit. And when we win in the First Circuit, we will then be in the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, the argument we will make is not what many of us would wish, overturn Citizens United. The argument will be under Citizens United, under the principles you've already established, you can see that this law is constitutional because it is attacking what the court has acknowledged is a risk of quid pro quo corruption. And you've said that's a legitimate basis for limiting the size of contributions. And I predict we're going to win in that court.
That is a hell of a prediction. So I want the audience to understand it so I'm as well as we can get it. So I'm going to go over it one more time. So you pass a ballot measure limiting money in politics in Maine. So then super PACs go, we don't like that. But in order to prove their case when they sue you, and by the way, for the audience, you should know, Professor Lessig knew they were going to sue. In fact, that was a huge part of the reason the ballot measure was proposed in the first place. Because of course the super PACs aren't going to let you limit them, right? So then they sue and they say, well, there is no appearance of corruption no matter how big the check is. That's where the court then shows skepticism, which again, you said before any of this happened would happen, and you were right about that. So now if it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, what you're saying is they're going to be forced into a decision. Does a huge check have any appearance of corruption at all? Or no, even if someone gives $300 million to a candidate, and that's not fanciful at all. The Adelson family has given over $300 million to Donald Trump's super PACs. No, we don't see it at all. There couldn't possibly be corruption. And what you're thinking is that the Supreme Court, in my opinion, in its infinite corruption, is still going to say, no, you're just too right. We just can't, we got to confess. Yes, a $300 million check would have an appearance of corruption.
Well, look, you're using the word appearance, Cenk, and I agree with you, but that's not actually the standard. It's even a stronger standard. Because it's the risk of quid pro quo corruption, not the appearance, the risk of quid pro quo corruption. And the DC Circuit, when the case that created super PACs, a case called Speech Now versus FEC, 3 months after Citizens United, said there was no risk of quid pro quo corruption when you made a contribution to an independent political action committee. 5 years after that, my favorite senator, Robert Menendez, was indicted. And he was indicted for a quid pro quo, and the quid was a contribution to his super PAC. So there was the thing the DC Circuit said could not happen, he was indicted for. Indeed, his lawyers had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss, saying the thing you've indicted us for, The DC Circuit says cannot happen, so we must be innocent. And that was the point at which it was obvious there was a mistake at the base of this whole ridiculous doctrine of super PACs. Now, I think it's important to make clear that under the law, it's absolutely clear super PACs have no constitutional basis. It's a separate question whether the Supreme Court will follow the law. And I think it's important to distinguish this because sometimes people say, for example, like our friend Bernie Sanders will say, super PACs are the end of a democracy. I agree with him on that. And then he says that we therefore have to overturn Citizens United. And I disagree with him about that. And the reason it's important to show that you don't have to overturn Citizens United is that you and I both know the chance of overturning Citizens United for this court is exactly zero. But if you can say to the court, look, you don't have to overturn Citizens United. You just have to apply the reasoning of Citizens United. And that reasoning is if there's a risk of corruption, you can limit it. Then if the court doesn't follow us, that shows just how extremely radical the court has become because they would be changing their doctrine to make it so they can uphold super PACs, not applying their doctrine, not refusing to overturn Citizens United. So I think it's important to change the baseline assumption here. And that is clear that the law is on our side. And it was made so incredibly clear so we have filed our brief in the First Circuit. And the week after that, 9 separate organizations filed amicus briefs on our behalf. Every single major campaign finance organization. There's a brief filed by Mark Cuban and 4 other billionaires talking about how ridiculous this whole system is. And there's a brief that issue 1 put forward that had 12 former Republican members of Congress and 12 former Democratic members of Congress talking about this. We wrapped these all together. There's a Kindle book right now available called Friends of a Corruption-Free Democracy by Equal Citizens. You can get it for $2 on Kindle because they force us to charge something for it, so it's not free. But these briefs are extraordinary in demonstrating both the corruption of the current system, the absolute corruption under the current system, and why under existing law, the state of Maine has the right to regulate it. And here's the bonus. If the Supreme Court follows their law and upholds this initiative, that very same reasoning will revive an existing federal law that limits the size of contributions, the law that Speech Now overturned, which means we could, by 2028, end super PACs, not just in Maine, but across the nation under federal law. And that, of course, would be a critical, huge victory coming into this next potentially most corrupt election we will have had since 2024.
Okay, I know we gotta go, but last thing here, I want the audience again to understand what a spectacular Supreme Court case this would be. Because here, I'll give one quick example. You all know 100 examples, but we recently covered the story of Larry Ellison talking to the Israeli ambassador and saying, I'm going to talk to Marco Rubio, and if he's pro-Israel, I will give him money. These are leaked emails, right? And then he comes back and reports to the Israeli ambassador, yes, Marco Rubio promised to be pro-Israel, so I put $5 million into his super PAC.
Wow.
I mean, it's quid pro quo, right? Yeah. So the Supreme Court would have to say, nope, I don't see it. And that would just be, it's almost admitting we're lying and we're pro-corruption.
Yeah, no, people don't want to believe in the court. I get that. There's a lot of reason to be skeptical. But you got to think about the politics from the court's perspective. Number one, it turns out super PACs don't benefit one side over the other. Like, Democrats raise as much money in super PACs as Republicans. It used to be Republicans raised more, but that's not true anymore. So there's no partisan reason. And then you think of the court itself. What's the institutional reason for it to change its doctrine to uphold super PACs? I mean, it's almost like I feel like I'm giving Chief Justice Roberts a gift. I'm saying to him, here's a case where you can say to the public, our principles are good principles. Our principles are right. Applying our principles, it turns out we can decide this case in a way that 90% of Americans will say huzzah. And the court will benefit from the fact that they can decide the case in a way that reflects the judgment of the vast majority of Americans. that this corruption has got to come to an end. And this is the first, not last, but first step to make that happen.
This is why we call Larry Lessig the godfather of the movement to get money out of politics. Godspeed, brother. Hope to see you at the Supreme Court real soon on this. We appreciate you.
Okay, great. All right.
All right, that's Professor Larry Lessig from Harvard. He's the one that gave me the idea. I don't want to, hurt his reputation, but he's the one that gave me the idea for what Wolfpack would do. Right? He didn't say form Wolfpack. I did that, but if this gambit doesn't work, there's only one thing left, and that's the thing we've been trying all along. And I think we should do it no matter what, which is to pass a constitutional amendment saying that no, you cannot put money into politics if you're a corporation. And the details of that are super interesting. Maybe we'll have him back on another time, because there's one thing that Professor Lessig and I agree on. Well, there's a million things we agree on, but in terms of trying out a convention, we would love that. There's the Supreme Court, I'm sorry, the Constitution has Article 5, and Article 5 says that you could have a convention called by 2/3 of the states to propose a constitutional amendment. And God, we'd love to see a convention of the American people, left, right, and center, coming together to discuss what should be in the Constitution. We would only be proposing it, and then 3/4 of the states would have to ratify it. So if you're interested in that, it's a beautiful way of doing it, and it would be the most shining example of democracy we'd ever see. That's why both Democratic and Republican leadership are dead set against it. But there's a grassroots movement on the right and a grassroots movement on the left to try to make that happen. And maybe we could have Professor Lessig back on to talk about a convention and how that would work, because I'd love to do that no matter what. A convention of the people would be just as, like I said, as good as you could hope for in a democracy. All right, so now, in the couple of minutes we have left here for this segment, I just wanted to ask you guys about the government shutdown, because here we are again, guys. You know, why do we need a revolution? What's interesting is that we have both sides claiming the other side wants to cut SNAP and wants to double the premiums. Because the Republicans don't admit it. They say, no, we don't want to double premiums. No, the Democrats shut the government down and blah, 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 blah. And they say, but yeah, now you're going to vote on it, you'll see, right? And oh no, it's because of the government shutdown that we can't pay SNAP, but we'd love to pay SNAP, full benefits. Well, we're gonna see, because now the government's not shut down. And so it doesn't look like they love it because, well, it hasn't fully passed yet, but Trump is still going in the court system and saying, no, I want to be able to cut SNAP whenever I want, and I want to cut it to 65% right now. He's in the court saying that. But that's not the interesting part. That's normal, regular politics. What's interesting is that they're having to lie, because both Republican voters and Democratic voters are saying, don't cut SNAP and don't double our premiums under the Affordable Care Act. So there's a populist revolt going on. So that's why the politicians are like, we really, really want to cut it, and we really want to double the premiums because those are our beautiful, beloved donors, but we're getting caught. I love it that they get caught. So quick poll, I don't know if we'll have time. Maybe I'll do the results of the poll in the members only part that I'll do at the end, where I tell a story after the next interview. But the poll is, was ending the shutdown without securing healthcare funding the right call? Yes, government must function first. We'll put this up in the live chat. No, it's a betrayal of working people. And the last one is unsure. Both sides made mistakes. So I'm curious how you guys can come out on that. But overall, guys, our government is clearly not working for us. That's why, and a perfect example of that is when they shut down the government and they go, well, now we got to cut your healthcare and your food, but don't worry, we're still going to get paid. Congress is going to get paid, the president's going to get paid, plus we're going to build golden ballrooms, plus we're going to have great Gatsby events, and we're just going to rub it in your face. And so, and then as Trump is doing that and the Republicans are doing that, the Democrats then turn around, their entire base does not want them to capitulate and to give in, and they go, nope, we're going to give in anyway. because why? It might harm the stock market. And of course, the stock market's the only thing we care about because it's the only thing our donors care about. And we're all stinking rich and we don't want our money to go down a little bit, etc. So there's 1,000 reasons that we need a political revolution. But at the very, very core of it is that our government doesn't work for us. So interesting results already there. So sitting at, this is a slightly different poll that we've got up on TYT.com. So, and in that poll, people are worried that this sets a bad precedent by giving into Trump. And that's the one that's leading here. Because once you give into him, and it doesn't matter if it's Trump or anyone else, once you give in to the guy who's holding the American people hostage through SNAP and healthcare premiums, etc., in order to get his way, what you do is you encourage hostage taking. So the next guy, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, is gonna think, well, if I take hostages and say I'm gonna hurt the American people, the other side will give in. Now in this case, this is a show for everybody to be united, but I am on the left and I've seen this movie 1,000 times. And in this particular case, the Republicans are the ones that usually take that hostage, and they took it this time. So that's why these questions are tough. Because do you help the hostages and reopen the government? But then you're giving in to hostage taking. And so wouldn't it be amazing if we had a government that was representative of us and didn't take us as hostages? That's what we're trying to work for and work towards on this show.